Hey everyone, this is a little review by Frederick Harry Pitts of the critique of Werner Bonefeld's critical theory and the critique of political economy on subversion and negative reason, published in 2014, so 10 years ago. I'm not absolutely sure when this came out. 2015 is when this review was written. So here we are. Let's go. In the tradition of the best critical and Marxist theory, this brilliant, vital book encompasses and challenges everything. Marx and Adorno are present not only theoretically, as implied in its title, but stylistically. The experience of reading Bonefeld's prose is rare outside these earlier paragons. It is audacious, breathtaking, and exciting in a way unmatched in most, quote, academic, end quote, writing. The book offers valuable resources for thinking and acting within, against, and beyond capital, but it is from the contemporary relevancy of its critical targets that the book derives urgency. Nationalist, quote, hard-working families, end quote, rhetoric, left anti-Americanism and anti-Semitism, idiotic conspiracy theories and morbid fascination with, quote, greedy bankers, end quote, leftish support for religious fascists and misguided anti-imperialism, Leninism, Keynesianism, calls for state regulation against, quote, neoliberalism, end quote. A whole litany of dead ends and misdeeds face withering critique. A veritable who's who of the UK left would profit from a copy gratis. But of paramount Marxological significance is Bonefeld's critique of the new reading of Marx, otherwise known as the Neue Marx-Lektura. See Bellafiore and Riva 2015 for a recent summary. Here I use Bonefeld's own terminology throughout. It is this that I will focus on in this review, as well as the political implications that follow. The aim of the book is to present the, quote, critique of political economy as a critical social theory, end quote. The critique centers upon economic objectivity and the political form of capitalist society. It exposes their imbrication in the relationship of class antagonism upon which capitalism rests. In the introduction to Part 1, Bonefeld outlines his conceptualization of the critique of political economy. Chapter 2 explores the social constitution of economic categories, drawing upon Marx and the Neue Marx-Lektura. Chapter 3 uses Adorno to explore further the social practices that undergird this constitution. Part 2 focuses upon the antagonistic social relations that sustain the law of value. It discusses their absence in the new reading of Marx. It attributes this to the new reading of Marx's interpretation of the, quote, logical, end quote, rather than the historical exposition Marx employs in Capital. Chapter 4 restates the importance of the separation of workers from their means of subsistence in the development of capitalism. It features a critique of the new reading of Marx on this point. Chapter 5 elaborates the significance of class as a key element of the capitalist form of wealth. Chapter 6 examines the relationship between class labor and its expression as abstract labor in exchange. It draws upon an enlightened debate held in the pages of Capital and Class with Alex Kisilov and Guido Starosta. I need to read actually those pieces by Alex Kisilov and Guido Starosta because you're not really understanding a debate if you only read one side, and unfortunately I've only read one side. This chapter and the earlier exchanges from which it derives are an unparalleled introduction to current disputes in Marxian value theory. Part 3 conceptualizes the critique of political economy as the critique of the political form of capitalist society, the state. The state and the rule of law guaranteed by force the law of value and the appearance of equal exchange upon which it depends. Thus the latter is not a general, objective economic relation. Its preconditions must be reproduced continually and politically. The two chapters in Part 3 focus on two aspects of this political basis. Chapter 7 theorizes the world market as both a corollary of the law of value and as means for the coercion of labor. Rather than undermining them, the world market implies the existence of national states. Chapter 8 casts the state as the vehicle for the depoliticization of exchange relations that is necessary to ensure the illusion of equivalence. Part 4 develops the anti-capitalist ramifications of Bonefeld's approach. Chapter 9 essays other critiques of capitalism. These individualize capital into the personalized forms of finance and imperialism. This is often in the name of an implicit or explicit anti-Semitism. This chapter in particular exhibits Bonefeld's astonishing critical power. The lineage with Adorno in this regard resonates in a series of inspired readings of his work. Chapter 10 tugs at this thread further. It expounds an Adornian conceptualization of resistance and negation. This chapter is an important contribution to understanding the current impasse in left alternatives. No imagining of the latter should proceed without having first considered Bonefeld's utopian realism. Saying, quote, no, end quote, is as complicated as saying, quote, yes, end quote. Negation of the present, according to Bonefeld, leaves nothing future certain enough to affirm. The headline theoretical innovation of Bonefeld's book is its subtle critique of the new reading of Marx. Key interlocutors here include Michael Heinrich, Moishe Pistone, Chris Arthur, Helmut Reichheld, and Hans-Georg Backhaus. See Heinrich 2012, Pistone 1993, Arthur 2001, Reichheld 2005, Backhaus 1992 and 2005. On surface inspection, Bonefeld is of a piece with these theorists. Bonefeld arrives from a similar Marxian tendency of reinterpretation and revisionism. Bonefeld has a background of published interaction and collaboration with many of its key names. See previously cited contributions to the edited collections Bonefeld, Gunn, and Psychopetus, 1992, and Bonefeld, Psychopetus, 2005. See also Heinrich and Bonefeld, 2011. Both Bonefeld and the other thinkers associated with the new reading take a Frankfurt School-inflected approach to Marx. This recasts the critique of political economy as a social theory. See Bellafiore and Riva, 2015. In this respect, the book is of this tradition. In his value theory, Bonefeld shares with the Neue Marx Lectura an anti-substantialist emphasis on abstraction and social validation. Indeed, Bonefeld acknowledges the important lead made by the new reading of Marx. The new reading of Marx, quote, introduced a Marxism stripped of dogmatic certainties and naturalistic conceptions of society, end quote. But for Bonefeld, the new reading of Marx's, quote, critical focus, end quote, is, quote, blinker, end quote. The new reading of Marx rightly undermines, quote, the orthodox instrumentalization of the categories of class and labor, end quote. But new reading of Marx goes too far in substituting these categories with the value form. This leads to a general neglect of labor, class, surplus value, and the separation of the worker from the means of subsistence. Where Bonefeld sees these as integral to the value form, the new reading of Marx has a tendency to underplay or ignore them. For Bonefeld, the study of the value form does not exclude labor power, class, surplus value, and separation, but presupposes labor power, class, surplus value, and separation. Valorization is predisposed upon the pursuit of profit. Profit cannot occur from the exchange of equivalents. Someone must lose out. Thus, surplus value cannot be absent from the conceptualization of the value form, but immanent within it. The motivation for equivalence and commensuration is the pursuit of profit from the appropriation of surplus value. This is because it is upon the exchange abstraction that the validation of this appropriated surplus value depends. Capital seeks to, quote, validate an exchange in the form of value, end quote. The, quote, appropriate of the surplus labor that capital, and appropriate, I think there's a typo here. Capital seeks to, quote, validate an exchange in the form of value the, quote, surplus labor that capital is able to abstract, end quote. It is only insofar as this happens that one can identify surplus value. But equally, quote, labor has to produce surplus value for money to maintain value validity, end quote. So the two sides are implicated in each other. The value relation and the exchange abstraction are, quote, premised, end quote, on surplus value. Because of the centrality of surplus value to the value form, class is the, quote, critical category of the entire system of capitalist wealth, end quote. Class, quote, appears in the form of an equivalent exchange between unequal values, end quote. Expressed in this, quote, real, end quote, appearance is the, quote, surplus value that has been, quote, pumped out of the workers, end quote, in Marx's words. Thus Adorno can make this his claim that, as Bonefeld puts it, quote, the mysterious character of the value form lies, quote, in the concept of surplus value, end quote. Class is central to this in that profit, quote, entails the class relationship between the buyer of labor power and the producer of surplus value as seller of labor power, end quote. This in turn implies the pre-existence of labor power as a commodity. The condition of this is primitive accumulation, the forceful and continued separation of workers from the means of subsistence. This sets them to market with only their potential to labor to sell. For Bonefeld, this story is seldom told in the work of the new reading of Marx. Bonefeld states that, quote, the conceptuality of the law of value is antagonistic from the outset, end quote. But too little of this antagonistic content is present in the oeuvres of Heinrich, Pistone, Reichelt, Backhaus, and Arthur et al. According to Bonefeld, this oversight relates to two broader imperatives. The first is the interpretation of Marx's presentational progression in Capital. From the new reading of Marx, this is a logical exposition. For Bonefeld, this reading irons out the specific historical content of the establishment of commodity exchange and the value relation. It aligns the centrality of property relations and the commodification of labor. The value form cannot be considered an abstraction from the continued unfolding of a historical process. The separation of one class from means of subsistence through enclosure, dispossession, and coercion. The creation of a class of workers, with another class purchasing their only means of survival, the commodified potential to labor. The continuing contemporary role of state and capital in reproducing and enforcing this separation. From each other, from nature, from property, from independent means, this division proliferates on a daily, national, and global basis. For Bonefeld, the book Capital's exposition is, quote, in reverse order to the actual historical sequence in which the social relations underlying Capital's categories developed, end quote. One understands the ape from the vantage point of man, rather than man from the vantage point of the ape, as in Marx. This history is not something of the distant past, but a continuing state of affairs that must be reproduced. A second imperative compounds the new reading of Marx's neglect of this antagonistic constancy. According to Bonefeld, the new reading of Marx holds the value form to be a, quote, abstractly self-moving essence of wealth, end quote. This conceptualization of the law of value as an abstract compulsion elides its antagonistic undertow. Rather than deriving from this abstract compulsion, the class antagonism is rather its, quote, constitutive premise, end quote. The equivalence of exchange that the theories of the value form explore has its basis in the pursuit of profit by way of unequal exchange. This unequal exchange is predicated on a class society. To ignore this is to adopt exactly the, quote, logical stance discussed previously. It sees the value form, quote, as some secularized thing that is valid in itself, as if value posits more value just like that, without certificate of birth, end quote. Thus Bonefeld has a dual critique of the new reading of Marx. The new reading of Marx focuses first on the account of Marx's purportedly, quote, logical, end quote, exposition. It then moves to the ascription of a, quote, dull compulsion of economic need, end quote. In both respects, the critique of the new reading of Marx flows from the book's radical political implications. This is two features. First, Bonefeld follows Adorno in understanding society as, quote, antagonistic from the outset, end quote. This shifts the focus of the critique of political economy from economic form to political. The second point relates to Bonefeld's sensitivity to the, quote, fire and blood, end quote, that sustains the value form. Understood like this, it is clear that the value form does not, quote, come about, ... and maintain itself just like that, end quote. Its, quote, reality is neither given nor assumed, end quote. Empowered with this insight, we can furnish ourselves with the means to, quote, say no, end quote. To critique and resist with a view to uncertain alternatives. But Bonefeld suggests that the new reading of Marx does lead us from at least one road to nowhere. For Bonefeld, the foundational work of Isaac Illich Rubin facilitated a decisive break with the lazy recourse to the hope of a socialist, quote, republic of labor, end quote. Rubin's critique of the, quote, naturalization, end quote, and transhistoricization of labor echoes through the new reading. It exposes the socialist ideal of labor as meshed within the fabric of, quote, capitalist realities, end quote. In common with other theoretical descendants of Rubin, Bonefeld, and the new reading of Marx, are resolute on the unviability of past dreams. Further, Bonefeld states that class is, quote, an entirely negative concept, end quote. No change occurs through the ascendancy of the dominated class to power. Nothing accrues in the generalization of one class position to all through full employment. For Bonefeld, this understanding of society as a negative category can only resolve itself in the, quote, classless society, end quote. Society is that of, quote, human purposes, end quote. Rather than a progression of history, this society represents, quote, standstill, end quote. We get there by, quote, thinking out of history, end quote, from within it, so that its wheels come grinding to a halt. In Benjamin, this notion of time standing still couples with the injunction to make a monastic leave of the world. Adorno, too, considered, quote, aesthetic ideals a more solid bulwark against the madness of the profit economy than the hedonistic life, end quote. The language of standstill, together with the will to withdraw from capitalist life, chimes with the emphasis Bonefeld places upon separation from the means of subsistence. Taken together, they suggest, quote, dropping out, end quote, the embrace of the simple, slow life, and a, quote, return to the land, end quote, as a possible escape route from capitalist domination. What? This harks back to the Frankfurt School preoccupation with nature. But to take forward Bonefeld's utopian realism, it points to alternatives realizable within the present time. The difficulty of saying, quote, no, end quote, and remaining negative is that this negation implies the affirmation of something. But this something must belong to a world that is wholly false. From it little or nothing can be redeemed. But Bonefeld espouses, quote, a realistic conception, end quote, of struggle. This is the realism of the struggle for, quote, crude and material things without which no refined and spiritual things could exist, end quote. Benjamin. This crude and material prize is not deferred until the revolution, but is for the here and now. Bonefeld contends that this determines the contemporary form that the class struggle must take. It must be a, quote, laboratory, end quote, for, quote, experimentation, end quote, with non-capitalist identities. Liberation depends upon a preemptory personal emancipation, whereby for Marcuse, quote, the slaves must be free for their liberation before they can become free, end quote. It depends on the development of a liberated self. A standstill is the, quote, muck of ages, end quote. A standstill in the, quote, muck of ages, end quote, cannot occur without the formation of such identities. They may appear in those ideas of the slow life, of permaculture, and of the return to the land, the reconnection with things themselves, that Bonefeld's analysis silently insinuates. They may spring from the cooperation and mutuality that forms in response to environmental and social degradation and the raw deal of the so-called, quote, Generation Y, end quote. Each of these begins to address the separation from the means of subsistence for nature and from each other, and it is on this basis that the commodification of labor power and subjugation of workers proceeds, and on which it must be fought. This is not enough, of course. Many of these whispers of non-capitalist identity are embedded in capitalist social relations, if only by implication. We can infer other possible identities from Bonefeld's chapter on anti-Semitism. This requires the affirmation of that which the racist imaginary negates by projecting it upon the figure of the Jew. Following Adorno and Horkheimer, Bonefeld unpacks anti-Semitic caricatures of Jewishness. They express a dominative repulsion with that which poses the greatest threat to the reproduction of capital's rule. Individuality and difference against sameness, happiness without the pursuit of possession of power, the immaterial unproductiveness of circulation and of money and ideas, so hated in bankers and intellectuals. The anti-Semite abhors, quote, wages without work, a home without frontiers, and religion without myth, end quote. The anti-Semite fearfully projects the possibilities of non-capitalist experimentation upon the figure of the Jew. It expresses their hate of all that they, quote, secretly long to possess, end quote. But Adorno's realism invites a wider aspiration. The critique of political economy as a critical theory of society, based upon antagonism, leads on to a critique of the political form of that society. The state guarantees the reproduction of the unequal relationship of exchange between the buyer and seller of labor power. It does so through the contradictory depoliticization of this relationship. This the state achieves by concentrating the political force of capitalist society within the institution of the state. This creates the false appearance of a separation between politics and society. The struggle against depoliticization obstructs state reproduction of unequal conditions of property and exchange. The struggle against depoliticization proceeds through a repoliticization of the social, of society. As such, quote, the great danger for the democratic state is the democratization of society, end quote. This directly, quote, challenges the distinction between society and state by politicizing ... social relations, end quote. This differs from what Bonefeld following Johannes Agnoli This differs from what this is a weird sentence. I'll just read what the sentence is. This differs from what Bonefeld follows Johannes Agnoli in labeling, quote, left Schmittianism, end quote. By this is meant anti-parliamentarian leftism and the Leninist vision of the state as an instrument of violence the working class wields against its foes. Democracy is a principle to extend rather than reject, control, or use. Bonefeld's book exercises an unintended effect. It encourages reflections that are far too affirmative for his Adornian critical standards. Primarily, the book points towards premonitory glimpses of how the democratization and repoliticization of social relations may look in practice. Take, for instance, cooperatives, assemblies, occupations, and other mutual and participatory groupings. Kojin Karatani writes persuasively of the dawning realization of the possibilities of, quote, associationism, end quote, in Marx's work. Projects along such lines have sprung up as a key response of, quote, Generation Y, end quote, to the twin assaults of social and environmental degradation. These intersect with green sensibilities around the connection to the means of subsistence to the soil and the provenance of one's meal. In this, a repoliticizing force suggests itself. It challenges the depoliticized maintenance of separation and dispossession upon which capitalist reproduction thrives. But ultimately, it does not go far enough. Bonefeld's realism, its non-affirmativeness neutralized, permits us to imagine piecemeal victories and small changes. This emanates within, but crucially against the present. Yet, as Marx argued, in order for those who live from the sale of their labor power to, quote, assert themselves as individuals, end quote, sorry, 1 second. Yet, as Marx argued, in order for those who live from the sale of their labor power to, quote, assert themselves as individuals, end quote, the final aim is to, quote, overthrow the state, end quote. This, quote, overthrow, end quote, attains not by controlling the state, but by abolishing the state in the form we know it. Academics have a part to play in this repoliticization of the social. It is impossible to understand capitalist society without understanding the conditions upon which people have no choice but to work. To understand this, one must understand in turn the separation from the means of subsistence. The result of this is that people cannot survive except from the sale of their labor power. And to understand this, one must understand that workers have to work to subsist, to sell their labor power to a buyer. This occurs under conditions of, quote, freedom, end quote, from the means of their own subsistence that must be reproduced politically and legally. As such, the economic cannot be understood without the social, and social cannot be understood without the political, and so on and so forth. The academic institutional framework divides intellectual inquiry into disciplines. It is a matter of career necessity to conform to this. One needs a department and journals in which to publish. The process divides knowledge into specialized areas of expertise that limit themselves to one aspect. They treat the social, the political, and the economic in isolation. How can capitalism be grasped from any one of these fragmented standpoints? It is not simply a question of moving freely within disciplines in an, quote, interdisciplinary, end quote, or, quote, multidisciplinary, end quote, way. These both retain the false stratification of knowledge that critique works to eradicate and put back together again. Rather, the entire edifice must be destroyed. Disciplinarity itself is a barrier to understanding work and life in capitalist society. Applied to work, the differentiation of knowledge and knowledge's pursuit into disciplines divides the social, the economic, and the political. Wittingly or unwittingly, it helps police the depoliticization of social relations. Disciplines do precisely what they say on tin. Discipline. They forewarn the disciplined, fragmented academy against approaching social totality in its manifold relations. The task is not to be interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary, but non-disciplinary. Ill-disciplined, utterly indefinable. A book of such scope as Bonefeld's, the possibility afforded by this are clear. At its best, the critical Marxist tradition has always had the liberty to transcend boundaries. It poses totalizing questions unasked elsewhere. In discipline, the depoliticized persists, but undisciplined academics, inside the academy and out, can repoliticize and denaturalize in the name of the critique of capitalist society. In Critical Theory and the Critique of Political Economy, Bonefeld shows us how. Ultimately, then, this book is a game changer theoretically, practically, and politically. From within the field, Bonefeld gives considerable pause for thought to scholars working with value form theory. We forget labor, separation, and surplus value at our peril. This resounds in the practical and political consequences of Bonefeld's analysis. Practically, it restores focus to struggles around subsistence, the separation from nature, and separation from nature and democratization. Politically, even where Bonefeld counsels against the affirmation of alternatives, the book generates a sense of hope. This hope comes from the sudden realization of where precisely one should look for signs of struggle. It sends the reader away seeking out existing, quote, cracks, end quote, see Holloway 2010, in the rule of capital, and hankering after the creation of new ones. This urgent, stirring book of everything demands reading. The end.